Great. Good afternoon and welcome to Creation in Crisis. We are a webinar sponsored by Creation Spirituality Communities that meets on the first Thursday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We feature speakers who are exploring the nexus between spirituality, cosmology, and activism, which align with the three vocations of creation spirituality: mysticism, creativity, and transformation. This series is offered to the broader creation spirituality community to empower us in responding to our environmental crisis from a spiritual approach as people who hold the earth and all life sacred. Our speakers address our crisis in creation through their experiences with earth activism, spiritual practice, science, cosmology, community organizing, research, environmental law, and the arts. Your hosts for this session are Gail Sophia Ransom from the Boston Basin on land ceded from the Massachusetts tribe, and myself, Penny Andrews from the Great Lakes bioregion, ceded from the Ho-Chunk people. And our tech support is provided by Bob Eisenberger from Toronto on land ceded from the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation from the Great Lakes bioregion. Bob, can you say a few words about tech for this session?
Sure thing, Penny, thanks. Just very simple. We ask that you keep yourself muted unless you are speaking, so as not to provide conflict between our speaker. And we hope to have some time for questions and answers. At that point, we ask that you look for the reactions button on your Zoom toolbar. And when you click that, you're going to see some words that say raise hand. And that will put you in the queue, and we can make sure we get to everybody, time permitting. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gail. I'm sorry, I've just...
Actually, Penny has a poem that Ted selected for us first. Sorry, I didn't. So maybe we'll go to that. Okay.
Okay, hang on. There you go, Penny.
All right. So this is a time for centering in to bring our focus fully to this afternoon's wonderful offering. And it comes from Rainier Maria Rilke. If we surrendered to Earth's intelligence, we could rise uprooted like trees. Rise uprooted like trees. Instead, we entangle ourselves in knots of our own making and struggle, lonely and confused. So, like children, we begin again to fall, patiently to trust our heaviness. Even a bird has to do that before he can fly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very nice. Beautiful. Thank you, Ted. Well, my name is Gail Ransom, and I'm very pleased today to be the interviewer for Ted Richards on this very important subject, which is reinventing education. We have a conversation going on in our country about, what's wrong with our schools, but Ted is able to connect it to the whole environmental crisis in the emerging global community and show us actual ways where we can change and bring the next generation up in a different way. I'm very pleased to have him here today. The title of our program today is Reinventing the Classroom, a shared inquiry into education. Let me tell you a bit about Ted. Theodore Richards is a visionary educator, writer, and philosopher. He is the founder of the Chicago Wisdom Project, now the Wisdom Project Incorporated, and editor of the online magazine and podcast Reimagining. You can have access to these from his website, Ted Richards. Dr. Richards has received degrees from various institutions, including the University of Chicago and the California Institute of Integral Studies. But he has learned as much, he says, by studying the martial art of Bagua, teaching in various settings around the world and with various kinds of students, and as a traveler from the Far East to the Middle East, from Africa to the South Pacific. Ted is the author of 8 books, but today he's going to focus on one. And I thought you might, Bob, put that up for us.
Sure thing. There we go.
So if you're ever in a conversation where people say, there's a problem, but I don't know what to do, tell them to go buy Ted's book. Not only gives you the theory, but it actually offers some solutions, which is what we need most. So here is his book. He is the author of 8 books and numerous literary awards, including the Nautilus Book Awards and 3 Independent Publisher Awards. His new book, Reimagining the Classroom, Creating New Learning Spaces and Connecting to the World, is scheduled for publication right now, December 2022. It's the focus of our presentation today. Ted lives on the south side of Chicago with his wife and his 3 daughters. I am so pleased to introduce you to Ted Richards. And Ted, welcome.
Thank you so much, Gail.
All right. So here I have a first question for you. Okay, so much of your book, I'm sorry, I've got this thing that affects my eyes. So here it is. Sorry, I'm going to be an old lady here. Okay, much of your book reveals. Get ready, Penny. Much of your book revolves around the question of story. Tell us about your own origin story. What influences inspired you to write this book?
Well, thanks, Gail. I guess I would start with some of my earliest experiences as a student, and I always like to say that the best classroom I ever had was behind my garage, where I could go. There was a space behind the garage where I grew up, and I could go dig and make forts and get dirty, and kind of explore the world that way, and let my imagination run free. I attended a large urban high school, which was highly racially stratified, very rigid. It was sort of modeled off of kind of this what I'll talk a little more later about, sort of modeled like a factory might be modeled. And I got to experience in that kind of some of the deep inequities of our educational system. And so like a lot of the work I've done, and later, especially when I was doing the work in Chicago and in Oakland, a lot of the work I've done was to look and say, why is it that we allow a certain kind of like creativity and freedom in some spaces, but not in others, particularly in this country? So the issue of justice and liberatory education became really, really profound for me at a young age. I think, as you mentioned, I went to the University of Chicago as an undergraduate, and there I met a woman kind of randomly. I was playing basketball, who invited me to go to her after school program. And it was there that I began to work with young people on the south side of Chicago. So I was attending this kind of like very elitist institution on the one hand, but working on the other hand on the south side of Chicago with people who are very much at the margins at the same time. So again, like I had this sense of the injustice of our system and the inequities of our system. And Sue Duncan became my mentor. I worked with her for many years. And I think what she constantly encouraged me to do as her student and also as a teacher was to explore. She would constantly ask, what kind of life do you want to have? She would say that to people a lot. And what is it you want to do with your life? And so it made me kind of think really deeply about who I was and my place in the world. I think you mentioned I traveled a lot. When I came back from traveling the world for a few years, I went back to school. And one of the people who I studied with was a guy named Matthew Fox, who you might have heard of. And so, you know, and as Matt and I started talking, I was a student, and this is in Oakland now, and I was a student, but then also we got to talking, and he was really interested in, as I think most people in this room are familiar with Matt's kind of pedagogical approach and how that is central to his mission, educating people in spirituality, and how if we're going to educate people in spirituality, it's not just the what that we teach, but it's also the how we teach it that's profoundly important. So Matt focused heavily on the pedagogy. At the same time he was doing this was in the early 2000s, mid 2005, I think I arrived in California. So, and what, if you recall, like, you know, Gail, you mentioned this big kind of question about what to do with our schools. And the big thing at that time was these heavily rigid kind of bureaucratic measures by the government, things like No Child Left Behind. And the idea was that we were going to focus heavily on testing. And rather than expand a child's sense of wonder and place in the world, the idea was to narrow the curriculum and focus specifically on that which is most testable. And so the theory that Matt had, and I shared that passion, was like, well, if we can teach the sons and daughters of the elite to explore their world and to be creative, we ought to also be able to do this to young, poor, Black and brown kids in Oakland. And so we started this program called Yell Awe, which we did I ran that program for Matt for a couple of years in Oakland before I returned to Chicago, where I had been, where my wife was from, and we had one daughter at the time. We came back to Chicago, and I started the Chicago Wisdom Project, which you mentioned there. You know, in terms of story, I should mention one other thing, though, that the recent book, the stuff I'm talking about now, a lot of its came out of what happened for me during the pandemic, when I sort of woke up one day and realized that I had 3 children and nowhere to send them every day, because we were in the middle of this pandemic. They couldn't go to school anymore. And we made the decision for our 2 youngest children to homeschool them during that period of time, rather than have them in some kind of remote situation. I have an older daughter who continued to do remote learning, but the 2 younger children who were primarily in kindergarten and first grade during this time. So I had them at home with me every day, and we had to wake up every day and consider not just what to teach, but another way of asking a question is what's really important in the world. And we did, and a lot of the things that I talk about are things that emerged during that time. And we, as a family, we moved off to Miami for the winter, and found a warm place to be and hunker down. And during that time, there was this news came from Chicago that a boy named Adam Toledo was killed by the police. He was 13, the same age as my oldest daughter at the time. He was a Chicago public school student. He was killed by the police in an alley. And so the conversation, the public discourse, took a turn toward the notion that although he didn't have a gun in his hand at the time, that someone had given him a gun at some point. And that was what led to his demise that night. And what it got me to thinking, and this is really how I started to write, was it got to me thinking the question of my own children, my own daughter, and the question of what have I put in her hand. And the thing about the gun that was in the boy's hand, it wasn't just a mere physical object in his hand. What was in his hand, what we do with all of our children or anyone whom we teach, is we put not just a thing in their hand, an object, a pencil, a book, a gun, we put a story in their hand. The gun carried with it a story, and it told him and the world about his place in the world, the value of his life. And so it made me really consider and want to sort of pursue further the question of what story I am giving my own children, what story can we give our children about who they are and what their place in the world is.
Thank you. That's a compelling story, really. Very compelling. So the work that you did in the Yellow, and then also again with the in the Chicago Wisdom Project. Now, how did those grow out of your interests, and how did they grow into your book? What did you take into your book?
Well, in a lot of ways, the book is sort of the culmination of all the work I've done over the years. Really starting with the work I did with Matt in Oakland back when we started Yellow back in 2000, I think it was 2006 or 7. So I moved. I mentioned I moved back to Chicago, and that was in 2009. And I kind of we come back here because in a lot of ways it was, even though I wasn't born and raised here, it was much like home for me, and my wife was born and raised here, and this was kind of home for her. And she'd been away for about 10 years or so and wanted to come back. So I kind of looked around, and there was like, there weren't a lot of jobs out there for like kind of a philosopher, poet, or whatever, on LinkedIn or wherever you look, Craigslist or whatever. So I essentially made up a job for myself. So I started a nonprofit. I started using some of the old connections I had, and we began to work with groups of youth. We went on retreats. We eventually ended up buying land in Michigan so we could do weekend retreats. We ran a week-long summer camp. We went camping. We were with groups of kids who had never been outside and seen like a really starry night at night. We had a community garden and food forest that we ran for a few years. We ran after school programs. And we also had a mission to kind of connect to the broader conversation about what actually it means to be an educated person. So we work with people, that's how this kind of online magazine and podcast and all those other things that we've done arose. And we eventually ended up, and that also allowed us to connect with people in other places. We connected with a group in Baltimore, which became the Baltimore Wisdom Project, and ultimately merged with them. So now we're running programming in multiple cities.
Hmm. And is this mostly, this is an after school project, is that right? I got from you have a website, I checked out your website and some of the videos of people who were leading projects after school with youth. So,
yeah, largely that's what we've done. Yeah, is after school, and we've done the two main things we've done are after school programs. We also work with a program called Youth Build, if anyone's familiar with that. That's a kind of a national project where groups of young adults, 18 to 24, who dropped out of high school, get job training skills and get their GED. What we do is engage people in a holistic way, though. We encourage people to look at the story they have about themselves and reimagine that story. That's kind of our focus, and I would just say that as far as context goes, like having the ability to leave the city together and be together in community and do programming that gets everyone together, not just being together to talk about stuff like ideas, but also sharing food, cleaning, cooking, doing all those kinds of things that people do in community and building, because I think the most fundamental thing that we can do is build community and create a culture of care around. And when you can do that, everything else kind of becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, that I saw the faces of some of your students on the Wisdom Project, your website, and you could see that holistic glow in them, that sense of being a full person. It was very beautiful. Photo after photo was just a beautiful testimony to what you've been saying. So I wonder about this concept of the cosmology of loneliness that you brought up in the beginning of your book, and the story of the child staring at the screen, and how you think this plays into our work for our culture and for the planet.
Yeah, so I use the image so I meant, as you mentioned in the beginning, I have 3 children, right? So my oldest child, well, my youngest 2 were homeschooled, and they were, we were their teachers, and they you know, did all kinds of things that we created for them. My oldest child, for reasons that are complicated, was, you know, she's a teenager, and she was in a Chicago public school doing remote learning for this period of time. Okay, so which, through no fault of the teachers, who actually I thought did a terrific job under difficult circumstances, to be fair, it was really not a good experience for her. And I just, it was just very hard for her socially. You know, it wasn't that so bad academically, it was just hard for her. And I thought, you know, as I watched her, and just sort of this thought of the idea that here we have an opportunity to really rethink what we're doing as parents, as elders, as educators, and we're almost sort of doubling down on this notion that we can replace authentic engagement and community with a screen. And of course, the options weren't very good during the pandemic. It was a hard thing, but I looked at that kind of as a metaphor for the way that we're thinking about school and education. So I think I don't have to do too much explaining about what I mean by cosmology to this particular group. But, you know, we're talking about how not just kind of like the story of the universe outside of us, but how we are actually a part of that story, and how it is an actual story that we participate in, and how it gives meaning to our lives, and how it shows us what our place in the world is. And that's the thing that we're teaching, whether we know it, whether we're conscious of it or not, in every classroom. We're telling a story. So when we have a teacher who sits up in the front and tells the students what to do, and the students sit in the rows, we're telling the students something about power in that situation. When a child has to raise her hand to use the bathroom, we're teaching that child who has control over her body, right? So all of these subtle things that happen in classrooms tell us a story about who we are and our place in the world. And I think that there's a way in which we have created a civilization that is hyper individualized with kind of industrial capitalism that focuses on competition. And we reinforce this in our classrooms. Our students have a sense that they're going to the classroom to compete with each other rather than take care of each other, rather than create collaboration and sharing and discovering how they're connected. They're told that they're in competition with each other. Not in every classroom, not every case, not by every teacher as an individual, but generally that's kind of the approach that our education system has taken. And it's a reflection of and reinforces, in a kind of recursive way, the values of our civilization. And I've argued that if you take this kind of hyper individualism that we have to the ultimate extreme, what you're left with is not what we think of as freedom. Often you hear this word freedom a lot in certainly in the United States. But if you take that sort of notion of freedom, which is hyper individualized, what you're left with is loneliness. And what I mean is that we do not cultivate a sense of our place as in kinship with other people and other living beings. And I think that ought to be a fundamental purpose of how we educate.
Oh, that was very important. Very important. I'm hoping, I have been hoping, maybe it's wrong-headed, that at this point we're in a crisis after COVID, the teachers are leaving, that the education is in a crisis. And I'm hoping that sometimes the crisis, or the via negativa, when things fall apart, is a chance for something new to be born. And that we might, because we are evolving, there was a time when we thought this was just right. The kids should compete with each other, and the teacher should slap them on the hands. Remember, I mean, it was really bad. Education was really bad for a while. So as we evolve into thinking what you're at the head of, you're leading this into the different kind of way of being together. What do you see might happen for American schools?
Yeah, so I share your guarded optimism about the schools. I mean, because I think you make a great point, right? Like, and it's kind of what I was thinking, you know, especially with the pandemic, it gave us an opportunity to see, you know, to see kind of and reflect upon a lot of things, I think.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it feels like, I mean, I think it's, so I don't think you're at all off base in that. And I think, and on the other hand, it's also true that sometimes in a crisis, people sort of double down in fear, right? Like there's kind of like, there's, you know, and I don't mean to oversimplify it, but I think and when we see kind of like, if we look around, you know, around the world today, we see, on the one hand, we see amazing, beautiful, progressive movements, right? And we also see a reversion to fascism worldwide, right? And I think that this is probably reflected in all aspects of human culture, right? So I think that there's a tendency to say, you know, absolutely, the school system is. My tendency is to say that our schools are, and our approach to education is so far off what we actually need that we are. Some of what happens, I think, is that we tend to look at things like, we tend to start with what we're doing now rather than imagine what's possible, I think. And that's sometimes we get caught in that like tendency towards keeping things as they are just because that's the way we've been doing them. And while there are efforts to change things, a lot of the time they're only small efforts because we have, I mean, like I said, I think the people who were teaching my daughter in remote learning were terrific teachers. It wasn't like they weren't working hard. It wasn't like they weren't smart. It wasn't like they weren't trying hard, but they had a lot of limits that were placed upon them by the system as we have it. So I am guardedly optimistic as we see how things don't work. The thing that's difficult that I think we have to get out of is looking at, I think we have to take a step back and look at what actually are we educating for? What is the purpose of educating our children? And what kind of world do we hope to create? And maybe that's the question we ought to ask more rather than think about how we can get individual success for a child, right? So if we can think about, are we creating a culture in a classroom that is a microcosm of the world that we hope will exist outside of the classroom? I think that ought to be the thing that we focus on. It's harder to test that, you know, like there's not like a multiple choice test for that. So that's sometimes why that's not the focus. But I am guardedly optimistic that people are at least really asking hard questions of what ought to happen with our schools.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, the testing, we're in the kind of juxtaposition of the two different eras. So the testing, as you say, and even national testing, well, that's from the old mindset, but still, you know, there's some people and people are in power. So it's going to be a really rocky difference. Is there a place where you find that a country or any place that you know of that is kind of doing a better job at this or farther forward on the evolutionary path?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that you know, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of talk about kind of the school systems in Scandinavia, for example, you know, how those are much more progressive than our own. And I think, and here's the thing, right? Like, I think that there are many models. I see someone said Waldorf in the chat. I don't see the whole comment because my screen's not viewable, but like, yeah, like, there are many examples of people doing great work, right? So I don't want to sit here and say like, no, there are not examples of this happening. For sure there are examples of it. What are few and far between are examples of those wonderful. I mean, I think the Montessori model. My two youngest children are in a Montessori classroom, and Maria Montessori has this beautiful vision for education and really understands the notion of cosmic education and fitting the story of the universe into the classroom, and how a classroom is actually a space for children to move and make choices and create a small world. Like I think that's a beautiful vision, right? What I would like to see those visions be implemented on more widely and among people who don't always have access to those kinds of visions. So, you know, and I think that does require a real shift in thinking about it.
Yeah, it does. So you talked, I wonder if you would say a little bit more about raising children to be being factory workers inside the industrial. Who would have thought that the industrial complex would come up down to this, which is what we ask of our kids. Excuse me, but I'm thinking about this quiet quitting that's been happening from people who have been treated as in factory workers, even though they're in plush offices and everybody at the desk, and they're asking, I wonder if you find a connection there.
So I think that, I use this idea of a factory as, and whether people are being trained as like, specifically, explicitly and consciously as factory workers isn't really the point. I think it's more a question of like, of the notion that a school or a classroom or any kind of learning space is rooted in metaphors. Is a metaphor for the world. So or a microcosm of the world, right? So in many examples, I use examples of different kind of metaphors that our school systems are often based upon, and a lot of it's for example, one example is a factory. If you are in a kind of conventional public high school, you'll move around like on a conveyor belt from class to class, and bells ring, and it's very rigid as far as like the timing of things, just as a factory would be. And so it teaches a conception of time that's rooted in a cosmology that evolved in the Industrial Revolution, right? When people began to sell their time, to sell their labor. You also have a model for many marginalized people of a school that's rooted in the notion of a prison. And it's very much like an Augustinian kind of fall from notion that the idea of an education system is to, or of a classroom or school, is to escape, right? It's to get out of rather than to have a flourishing experience within creation, within the world that we're in. Or the other model that I think is very common is the model of the free market. And it's used in things like No Child Left Behind or the Race to the Top, where schools are competing with each other. And this is a very free market capitalist notion of schools. All of those things are highly individualized models. It's like the idea is we enter into these spaces as individuals, and we enter into these spaces in competition rather than a relational space. And so I think what's healthy and a shift that could happen is we could think about metaphors or think about learning as not fundamentally an individual process, but as a fundamentally relational process. And that's a cosmological question. It's a question of what is the fundamental story we tell ourselves about what it means to be human.
Well, I think you're segueing into the next question, which is, what is the role of the universe story in your vision for education? And you've touched upon it, but I'm sure there's much more.
That is a good segue, yeah. So, I think the universe story can be a fundamental part of not just the kind of side dish, but a fundamental part of a new vision for education. I think that when we look at, there are a lot of different ways we can look at kind of like core narratives that kind of connect us and bind us together. And I think that's one great example. It teaches us how we're all connected through time and space. And I think that it provides a narrative, a story that we can not just talk about science or not just talk about cosmology in a narrow sense, but we can link kind of all of history, all of science through that narrative. In other words, we can think about how chemistry isn't just a series of math equations. Chemistry actually is something that arises at a particular point in the universe story. The chemicals in our bodies and on the earth were created in a certain way out of this cosmic process. The human arises out of this evolutionary process. We used to do, my kids and I, which I learned from my good friend Larry Edwards, who some of you may know, the cosmic walk. So we had a long rope that was 140 feet approximately, and we had these markers on the rope, and we would sometimes explode. My youngest child liked to explode and run the 140 feet, but there were different markers on it that represented different moments of evolution, different things emerging. And what's beautiful about the universe story is that each of those elements, these things that emerge in the universe story, whether it's a star, or whether it's life itself, or whether it's mammals, these are our ancestors and these are us, and we're related. Again, so the question is, who are our kin is a more important question than kind of how can we strive and succeed and outcompete this person sitting next to me in the chair. So, and I think the answer through the universe story is that everyone is our kin.
Well, and related, how does creation spirituality lineage inform your work?
Well, that would be one example for sure. So I don't need to expand on that. And, as I mentioned, a lot of the work arose out of, my relationship with and work with Matt in Oakland. And also we've kind of collaborated over the years on a lot of different things. And, our work is still very much connected, So yeah, for sure, cosmology and ecology. The notion of the importance of justice and liberation. This isn't just about kind of individual success, but about how we can lift each other up in community. And a lot of the work we do centers on spirituality in our interior lives, right? So this happens collectively through rites of passage, through restorative practices. It happens individually through mindfulness practices that we engage in. And these are all interconnected, right? So mindfulness is important. Mindfulness is an important part of being connected to nature and ecology, right? Because being aware of and present to the natural world around us is a part of finding that deeper connection. And of course, the pedagogy that creation spirituality emphasizes, and in terms of being holistic. So we take a very holistic approach, looking at the human, not just as it's not anti-intellectual, because the intellect is important, but it includes the body, it includes the heart, it includes thinking of the self, not just as an individual self, but in a much more kind of expansive way. And then of course, and maybe the most significant thing probably is the emphasis on creativity, because the ultimate, rather than a multiple choice test, the test is, how have we reimagined our story, and then how can we express that? So a lot of the work that we do is around storytelling, and that comes through making movies, through poetry, through music, all different kind of ways that we can express ourselves and tell our story. And that, of course, is fundamental to creation spirituality.
I'm remembering, I can pop in with this, Penny. I'm remembering when Matthew would talk about, it used to be you went to university to find out your place in the universe. So it was the universe city. So it's the city of the universe. Whereas now, they even complain now that in our colleges now we're preparing people for jobs, which actually may not be here in 7 years or 10 years, but that we've got this machine going all the way through. People, you can born, live, and die, and never know yourself.
Yeah, I understand the desire to as a parent or as a young person, say in college, to want to get a job and be able to take care of yourself. I get that. So I don't want to be dismissive of that at all. It's absurd though that we're focusing on sort of how we can have, we have 5-year-olds, kindergartners, talking about how they'll compete in the global economy, which is a thing that we don't even know if it will exist, because the global economy is literally destroying the planet and our capacity to be alive on it. So that feels like, yeah, that feels like, I agree, Gail, that feels like the wrong approach for sure.
Yeah, how long it is through. Well, let's find some right approaches. Don't you have in your book ways to set up the classroom? Do you have anything to suggest to us, so that we are at a conversation at a dinner party someday and people say, oh, education's terrible, but what can you do about it? we can say, well, here's something you can do about it. Can you give us any solution to those awkward moments when we know what we want to say, but we can't figure out a story for it?
Well, I actually think that a lot of the struggle that I think a lot of educators, a lot of teachers know what's not working, and I think that and want something different. I think that one of the challenges is to find language and ways of talking about it it kind of moves outside of the conventions of the system that they already have. So I kind of get what you're saying there. I think that what I would say, and this isn't necessarily an easy solution or an easy thing at all, I think I would suggest that rather than focus on a job that we don't know if it's going to be there, and rather than focus on a test score that really only reinforces our ability to teach what's on the test. And the problem with tests isn't so much that testing is in itself is bad. Testing does tell you something. The problem is testing doesn't only tells you what it tests for. So if we and there are things that are testable and things that are not, so if we focus our education system only on that which is testable, we miss out on like most of what's really important in the world, important in life. For example, I think that, and this is where it gets hard, I would just suggest that a learning space is a space to discover one's place in the world. It's a place that offers us a series of symbols and metaphors, or even a microcosm of the broader world. So rather than think about how we can create successful students, perhaps let's think about what is a vision of the world that we'd like to create. And then let's create a space in which we can find a way for students to thrive. And I think this is a lot of the problem, a lot of the reason that we don't find some of these more creative models in many learning spaces, because what I'm asking is for a certain amount of humility and for a certain amount of trust that our young people can figure some of this stuff out, right? So I think the job then as an educator is not just to teach stuff, it's to actually create a space in which an organic and a relational process can occur. And that's not easy, that's not simply testable, but I think it's actually the best way. And I think it's the way that we'll actually begin to then reimagine. And the reason that reimagining a classroom or a school or education is so fundamentally important is because all of the systems that we have are rooted in these stories we tell about what's important, about what our values are, about who we are, right? So our economic system, our choices about how we spend money in the government, all of these things are rooted in a story. Like if a city like Chicago chooses to spend 75% of its money on police, that's rooted in a story we have about what's important. If a government such as the United States chooses to spend equal amount of money on the military, that's also rooted in a particular story about what's important, about what we need. And so I think that in order to change the story that, for example, that we are here to control, we have to relinquish some control. And that's very tricky because we think we know the answers, right? We want to we think we have a story to tell. And it's very tricky because it's not my job to tell my children what to think about stuff, even though I think I'm right. And I want them to think what I think. My job is to create a space in which they can think for themselves. But the space is very important. The way that we cultivate the space is very important, and it's not neutral. It's not random. So how we create a space for this organic and relational process to happen is the most fundamental thing, I think. I don't know if that helps you at a dinner party, Gail, but that's what I got for you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll say that verbatim the next time. But I was just saying, you want to tell your kids now what to think. Wait till they are adult children.
I have a 14-year-old, so she's not here.
Just
don't worry about it. I
know. Your mouth, hoping to be able to not say anything so they can discover their own path. Okay, well let's go back to the book. You have chapters. You named them in the terms of cosmos, arts, spirit, hands, justice, and joy, which you call social emotional justice. Can you tell us why?
Well, in part of the book, I sort of created a curriculum, and it was, I should say that, the notion of subjects is in some ways problematic, because I think that we ought to think much more kind of fluidly about how different subject matter can kind of interact with each other. So what I really try to focus on is what I also focus on heavily is a pedagogical process that we should enter into. And for those people who are familiar with kind of University of Creation Spirituality, this will be not unfamiliar to you, because we have a process that involves our internal process and mindfulness. It involves creativity, it involves the body, it involves the mind, so it involves different elements. And so it's a holistic process. It's holistic not just in the individual sense, but also holistic in the sense that we think of our individual selves in a more ecological or interrelated kind of way. So every subject that I touch on is engaged in a holistic kind of way, and the focus is on the process. But I chose ways of thinking about what I think are the fundamental subject matter in a way in which they overlap and they're interconnected, and they're each approached in a holistic way. So, like, for example, if we're talking about say hands, which is more like about hands-on learning and work, some of that involves also creativity, some of that involves social justice, some of that involves intellectual work. So each of the different subjects would involve different things that kind of overlap and interconnect. And the idea being that I think that rigidly separating and segregating subject matter isn't really entirely helpful or realistic about how the world is.
I'm wondering, is the body also involved as you talk about this? Because physical is very much left out of education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's ridiculous to think about, like, that we, it's like we've got, like, I watched my oldest daughter, who was like 12 in the beginning of the pandemic, and she's 14 now. Just knowing she was going through so many changes physically at this time in her life, and knowing how, like, if you've ever been around a group of adolescents, just how much of what's happening there is really, really rooted in this kind of physical process they're in, and it's true at any age, but absolutely. So one element of the kind of like the pedagogical process of any subject is embodied practices. So that's a huge part of what we do. And it's true in the pedagogical process for every subject, but there's also a specific subject which I refer to as hands, which has to do with our work. It has to do with what it has to do with making things, fixing things, cooking, it also has to do with, like, embodied practices. So these subjects overlap and intersect, but embodied practice is a huge part of it, just like in the creation spirituality tradition.
You write that the classroom is a metaphor for the world. How can educators nurture this sense of world making among students?
So I think that, that's kind of the fundamental question, is how, not so much what we teach, but how we can kind of cultivate an awareness among adults and educators about that's really the fundamental thing that they are doing, is creating a little world. And it's true with parents too. It's true with grandparents. It's true if you're in an after-school setting. It's true if you're running a church group. So it's true in any setting in which learning and teaching is happening, is that we're creating metaphors for the world. Any kind of learning space can be a metaphor for the world. At one point, I sort of look back at this image of, one thing I was really profoundly impacted on was when I was a college student. Actually, I spent a year in an archaeological dig in northern Spain, and I got to see the cave paintings at Altamira. And I think that the paintings, the handprints that are on the walls of these caves, which are simultaneously a womb and also a vision of the cosmos. And I think they got that then. And so I think maybe we can get now that what we're doing, and those were like the original classrooms, right? So what we can do now is we can understand that if we have a classroom, and I'm using the word classroom loosely, not just a room with four walls, it's a space in which learning happens, that what we're doing is we're creating a metaphor for the world. And so for example, I'll give an example of that more specifically. If we want to teach our children how to create a more just world, we can and should talk about things that are happening in the world outside, for sure, right? So we can talk about the Supreme Court, we can talk about police brutality, we can talk about a lot of different things, and those are important things to talk about. But that also should be accompanied by the recognition that we have to create a just environment in the classroom. So when there is conflict in the classroom, how can we use restorative rather than punitive ways of dealing with that conflict? How can we create a space in which everyone is both seen and heard? So if we're not doing that, we're just talking about stuff happening outside, we're not really teaching justice. We're teaching about justice, but we're not teaching justice. So that's just an example of, so I think so understanding that the classroom itself is a space in which those values are reflected.
You know, Ted, when you talked before when we met and also today about relationship, it brought up to me the conversation that we had with Sarmeet Kamal during our last time. He was a quantum physicist, and he was talking about the essence of life is relationship. Nothing is alive if it isn't relating to something. So you can't just be a thing. You have to be, and I thought of that when you began to talk about relationship, because we're also modeling and becoming participating in the essence of the universe by having a relationship with each other. I don't know if you would like to comment on that, or Sarmeet wants to.
Yeah, well, I'll just say this, and I'm happy for him to speak as well. I think that I am less familiar with that notion from the perspective of a physicist than I am. I tend to think of it in the Buddhist sense, and so from the view of Buddhist cosmology, we have this notion of anatman, which means no self, right? And so there's this idea that the self is fundamentally empty. And it doesn't mean we don't exist. What it means is that when we try to pinpoint this thing, who we are, in isolation, we can't, because we are so fundamentally enmeshed in this web of relationships. Because what we fundamentally are is relationship. The universe itself is fundamentally relational, okay? And so I think that we ought to use that vision, and it can be used from different perspectives, but that's just one way of thinking about it, as a way of thinking about how teaching and learning happens, and thinking about it in terms of a relational process, a process of that we sort of learn together. Even when we think about a text, like if you're reading something, it's not a concrete thing that exists on the page. It comes alive as we engage with the text. It comes alive. A work of art becomes alive as we engage with that work of art. It's in the relationship that the thing happens. In fact, anything that is happening today is like, I mean, the whole point of this conversation is so new things can emerge in relationship in the conversation. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if not, I could just send you guys the book and we could just go home. You know what I mean? But like, maybe we'll learn something from each other in the process, in this relational process, because for each person in this room, they're going to hear something different that I've said. They'll see it through a different lens, a lens that's informed by their own story. And so I think that shifting from this kind of highly individual, competition-based worldview to one that's more relational is absolutely essential.
Wonderful. You know what I think, if you're willing, Bob, to do this for us, I think this might be a good time for us to be relational and go into go into breakout groups. Would that be possible, Bob? We didn't talk about that, but I think it might really be good at this moment for groups of maybe 3 to take for 5 minutes, groups of 3 to take say a minute each to say, what did you notice that you had always realized but never had the names or the words for it, or what new information that Ted is giving them that they find very stimulating. So basically a reflection of what you've heard thus far, and a minute each, and the person with the shortest hair will be the timekeeper. Oh, sorry. I always hope that you would ask them to raise their hands, and Bob and you would call on them.
Okay. So again, if you have a question for Ted, please use the reactions button, and under there you'll see the words "raise hand," and that'll put you up in the corner, and we can call on you. So Patty, there you are, starting us off.
Okay, I guess I have a question about addressing this maybe from a political point of view or something, addressing our educational focus, refocusing. And I don't know, Ted, if you've been involved at all in securing Board of Education nominees who have a clue about what you're talking about. And if so, how do we couch what they would be proposing on the Board of Education so that it would have a snowball's chance in hell of actually being implemented?
So I do not have that experience. You know, I do think that, you know, one of the things I've tried to work on are ways that, because I think your question is framed in a really intelligent way, and that it focuses on our the struggle we have sometimes in our way of framing things. You know, like how do we talk to people in a way that they'll hear, because we're talking about things that are radically different from what people are used to. So that becomes a really big challenge. You know what I mean? So I think that you know, what's really important is that I guess I'll say that, you know, that we learn how to talk about things from a perspective and really kind of listen to, you know, I think about having come back here to Chicago after having been in the Bay Area for like 4 years, you know, and I think about how kind of like some of the language that like people in the Bay Area were comfortable with, people here in Chicago were a little less comfortable with, you know what I mean? So it's like, so how do you have this conversation with people? Like, people don't necessarily, if you say cosmology, people in San Francisco are a little more, you know, they're a little more ready for that word than in Chicago. But I think what that requires is like an exploration. First, I would say two things about that. It requires actually listening to communities and what their deepest concerns are, right? So I would say that would be one thing I would suggest, that regardless of, you know, it kind of goes back to this notion of like, that no matter how great we think our ideas are, we do have to actually recognize that people have their own ideas about what's important and listen to those ideas, right? And I think that the other part is language, you know. I think that we can talk about, there are things that we can talk about that I think that are going to resonate with people if we use the right language and don't sound and say things in ways that are more helpful. One of the things I changed a lot of like kind of the language that we used to use in Yelaw in Oakland when I came to Chicago. You know, there is an openness, for example, to meditation. And if you can describe meditation in a way that people understand how it can be helpful to someone, that it's not, say, like, you know, a religious thing or something like that, you know. So there's ways we can talk about some of these things that people will hear, I think, you know, and it's not changing what you're doing, it's just finding language that people will actually listen to and hear. So, you know, as far as the politics of it, I don't, you know, it's so local too, right? It's different in every example. So I'm not entirely sure how to answer that, you know, in a global way. But I think that like listening to, being aware of kind of what the community's needs are, I think that in generally speaking, I think if we really listen to what people have to say, I want to suggest that part of the process is actually listening to people, you know, like part of the shift is actually listening to what communities' deepest interests and needs are. So that doesn't solve all the political issues, because there are a lot of political issues that are really challenging, but I think that's maybe a start.
I wonder if
There
for someone else to speak up. I'm just curious, Ted. Now you said you've not had this opportunity to actually work the political side or work it into an actual curriculum, but I used to work for a nonprofit that was focused on water, for example, and it turned out that the provincial curriculum, which all schools, all teachers at each level had to promise to deliver the given curriculum at a given grade level. Someone went ahead and did the work and found out a way to map this into an inquiry-based learning focus, made it very participatory, made it very student-driven, and yet it was delivering the content of the curriculum, just in a way that was different from the standard classroom. Thank you, Roberta. I saw that thumbs up. And I just wonder if you've heard of that kind of approach, or if you've have any kind of comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's great to hear. It's a great comment. I think that a lot of change can happen, as I've said before, not just in terms of, certainly changing a curriculum would be useful and important, but I think that I love the way you said that, because it was like you're talking about not changing the curriculum. It's still, you know, they're learning the things they're learning. It's not that they're bad things or they don't need to learn them, but like, let's think about a way we can teach differently, right? And I think that's really important, and I think it's as important as anything. So I love that.
Great, thank you. Roberta, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hi, I just want to say that to you, Ted, Dr. Richards, I was very excited about just about everything you were saying. And I like the fact that you just used the word shift, because I'm connected with the Institute of Noetic Sciences out of California, and they're talking about the big shift. First, they were talking about the shift to the paradigms, and then they were talking about the big shift. And I think that's what we are in. And I also like the fact that you mentioned COVID as a possible opportunity for us to bring a change in American education. And I'm very excited about that. I've done an after-school program called the Creativity Labs for a local high school. It's the Alternative Arts High School. And I'm an art therapist, and I know, as do most people in mental health, that we can identify the problem kids in elementary school. I know from decades of working in psychiatric hospitals that the kids of troubled families and the troubled kids are known to elementary school teachers. And I liked what you just said about, let's listen to what's needed. Let's respect the curriculum, but let's also have participatory education. And I speak to that as an art therapist because I believe we have trashed too many students. And I think both Gail and you have said that everything is what is testable. That's what we're going to go for in education. And that's typically the word. That's typically a written test. And I believe that the focus on verbal education has trashed a lot of students. And I have identified, and I've worked with these kids in several adolescent psych units. They're pre-verbal learners. They're not non-verbal people, they're pre-verbal learners. And what you're talking about, in my opinion, experiential education, participatory listening, having kids engaged, I think we will trash less students if we have holistic education. And that is, we're not just teaching to the verbal test, we're looking at the pre-verbal. We're looking at music as part related to the primary brain, and it shapes our life in the most fundamental ways. Movement, I think someone mentioned the absence of movement in education these days, and of course the visual arts. And I think consciousness and mindfulness starts exactly where you said, it's that hand in the cave. So I want to hear more and more, maybe I have to buy your book and I'll do that. I want to hear more and more about your concept of the holistic curriculum, which doesn't trash any of the kids. All our learners of all their different ways of natural learning, those that are pre-verbal learners in the arts and those that are verbal. I would love to hear more about your holistic curriculum. What would it look like? How would you re-image the classroom? What would it look like?
Well, I mean, there's a lot. Thank you so much. There's a lot there. I want to say, before I talk about the holistic part, I just want to say that I think that I really appreciated what you said about sort of not trashing any students. And I think that we have this phrase, at risk children, right? And it's sort of a funny way to think about things when we're clearly on an at-risk planet, and we're an at-risk species. So we're all sort of at risk, aren't we? So I think that rather than thinking, I draw from, I love this phrase that Martin Luther King used of creative maladjustment. He said that human salvation is in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. And this is the idea that if you're living in a sick society, that the notion isn't to be well adjusted to that society, but to figure out how to be maladjusted in a way that is creative rather than destructive. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very much what you're talking about here, for sure. And also too, like, people learn differently. I see this, this is not just like with other people's kids that I've worked with, but like with my own children, I see that they're each very different, and they each have different learning styles, and I have one who's dyslexic and one who can't sit still and needs to be doing handstands while she's doing anything else, right? So I got all different kinds of learners in my own house, much less, in any other classroom that I've worked in. So, so I think that, there are a lot of details to go into, like talking about how, what that holistic space looks like, but it starts with, I think, the cultivation of a recognition that we enter into a space in community. Okay. And it moves through different elements of what it means to be a self, including our bodies, our minds, our hearts and souls, our inner life, so those things. And then also like a further recognition that our work in the classroom is to take care of each other, and also to create, something meaningful out of the experience. So, and throughout that process, the hope and expectation is that different, different aspects of the self are touched on in the different ways of learning. I think, for example, thinking about multiple intelligence theory and how we have different kind of ways of being smart. Rather than I'm smarter than you or you're smarter than me, we may have different ways that we're smart. You know what I mean? Like, I do good with verbal stuff, you know what I mean? Like, I'm good at reading and writing, but if something in the house is broken, I got to call my wife to fix it. You know what I mean? I can't put anything together, because I'm not that smart when it comes to that stuff. You know what I mean? Like, that's not my gift. So, and I'll say, and I talk a lot about this, like, let's think about what are the gifts that we bring, because everybody's bringing some kind of a gift. So what is that gift? Maybe that's, I think, a good starting point.
Excellent, thank you. Sir Meek, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I've really enjoyed this session. Ted, thank you very much for your wisdom.
Thank
The thing that I was wondering about, you mentioned the metaphor of the world, the outside world, and how to design the classroom so that it's a reflection of what we want to see in the outside world. And I was thinking, are there ways in which we can bring more of that outside world itself into the classroom? Are there ways in which students can be put in touch with what's going on there, perhaps by either bringing real life professional people into the classroom to talk about what they do, or to have the students go out into the work environment or into any environment for that matter and see things for themselves rather than sitting in the classroom and learning just from the teacher.
Yeah, I think that's essential. I mean, and also too, just like when I'm using the word classroom, like I'm really not thinking of a room with four walls, right? So I'm thinking of a classroom can be a forest. A classroom can be, space behind the garage to build a fort. That can be a classroom, right? It can be a starry night. So, and it can also be like, but I think like, thinking about ways, as you're suggesting, thinking about ways to engage with the world, are fundamental to the learning process, right? Because that's what we're talking about here, in terms of like, we are talking about what kind of world we want to create. So it's important that we actually are engaged with what's going on in the world too, So I think, yeah, getting out of the, planting a garden, we used to have a forest here in Chicago. All those things are really, really important, and I think like, asking questions about kind of what's happening in the world beyond the classroom it's an important part of, I think that, and this isn't quite a cosmic question, but I do think it's important that our schools ought to give us some of the tools to participate in a democracy. And that requires that we don't only focus on personal success or test scores, but that we learn how to kind of engage with the world and see what's happening in the real world. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mary Ellen, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks so much, Ted. This has been amazing. I'm a retired educator now, and I so wish we could teach together. I just love it. So I also loved what Bob talked about, because it's an interesting paradox here in Ontario, where we have conservative government dictating that method that is all about testing and widgets, and it feels like a factory in a prison. And yet within that context, the majority of educators are being very creative. And one of those things was the inquiry method that Bob referred to, which is all about the whole curriculum. I mean, we will come up with the larger theme of water, say that Bob did with water docs, but you present it, you initiate the discussion, and then the learning comes from the students. It's their questions. We keep pursuing their questions, and it's very, very powerful. So certainly that's been what I've done in my classroom. And I've always thought there's, as you look in a classroom, there are always multiple ways of learning, multiple intelligences. Get away from that IQ testing and look at, creative intelligence, hard intelligence. So to me as an educator, it was all about every day getting outside, every day, including every form of the arts. And I started off every afternoon with meditation. And so therefore, there was a justice element that was happening in the classroom where I didn't ever have to be punitive. I didn't have to pick out an individual, and I could just say, you know what, we're human. A few things happened this morning on the playground, and I know that various folks were not happy about it, but we're going to breathe and we're going to just start over. And that's, really what we can do as human beings. And it was incredibly powerful. So, and then in my latter years, I ended up teaching dance to the school, like and dance. I mean, ultimately, I found at the elementary school level, the kids need to move, first of all. And dance is that movement and creativity. And my favorite colleagues would always say, you know what, Mary Ellen, I always gave the most challenging project after dance because they were open, they were ready. And what I loved about it was that kids who would be deemed not successful academically could absolutely dance something and show that they completely and more than got the concepts. So it is around this larger way of visioning education. And so I just love that question you said, imagine what's possible. And that to me is when we talk about the environment. You know, so often people are going, well, I don't want to give up my flights and I don't want to give up my car. Could we not instead imagine, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all ride our bikes everywhere and maybe just walk to wherever we're working and have, you know what, it's just imagining a better world. Anyway, I'm loving this and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for that. I mean, that's your class. What age did you teach?
Well, at the end, I was teaching from grade 1 to grade 6 dance to everyone.
Okay.
I primarily was, and I really started to feel that, you know, you really need to turn the kids on in primary. So I was in grade 2 and grade 3, and it was just like a dream as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, those are the exact ages of my grades of my 2 younger kids.
Yeah, just
so
amazing.
I love those ages. I love I mean, they're like, you know, those are great ages. I mean, I like all ages, but they're.
Well, and, you know, just even one final thought, you know, the whole notion, and I never paid attention to that. We're going to have 40 minutes for math and 40 minutes for what a ridiculous notion. Because the kids are getting excited. If you're turning them on to a project, you've got to have it integrated. So all of those subjects integrate in something that turns them on. It's not just I'm teaching this in isolation and in this time frame. That's not how we learn as adult human beings. And you want to embody it. You want to dramatize it. You have to think outside the box.
Yeah. In reflection on the time thing. So really briefly, I'll share a story about that. I once taught in an adult literacy program in rural Zimbabwe, and it was like these were women living in rural villages in an area without electricity and without any sense of time. Like there was a sense of time, but a sense of abstract linear time. So people did not own watches or clocks, right? And yet the NGO that I worked for scheduled classes, which would happen like under a tree or something like that, like, or in a village at very particular times, and really highly emphasized people showing up on time and having a schedule. And what became clear to me was like, what we weren't so much teaching reading and writing as we were teaching people how to then enter into a global economic system that they were not yet a part of, but training people to work on a schedule was actually more fundamental to what the lesson was. And I think there's a little bit of that happens in a school system, even if it's not conscious, and the teachers aren't. I mean, I love listening to you talk, Mary Ellen, because it was like it reinforced my belief, which is that in spite of whatever kind of political focus there is and kind of cultural inertia toward a certain approach to learning and teaching, that I think teachers fundamentally do understand the need to work and really want to work in a more organic, fluid, relational kind of way for the most part. I think that's true. So yeah, I mean, I love listening to what you were saying about all that. You know, I think that's great.
No, we're about time to end up. I did want to add, Ted, on that last comment that I was taught a proverb, which was, when God created the world, God gave European watches and gave Africans time. A different concept of time. Beautiful gift.
And
so
it's a fairly recent thing in Europe too. I mean, it wasn't like, you know what I mean? Like if we look at the notion of everyone having a sense of a precise time, it really doesn't emerge until the Industrial Revolution, you know, training schedules and things like that. So it's a fairly recent development in the course of human history, you know.
Yeah. So Ted, I want to thank you so much for giving us your time and your energy and your positivity and your vision for what our children, our education, our youth can be, and what part we might be able to play, at least in holding the consciousness of it, so that we can leave from today being able to see and imagine a different way for our children, and know that that's an important path to pay attention to. So I just want to thank you very much for giving us your time. And hope people want to join me with that.
Well,
We have
I want to thank you for having me. I had a great time.
oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. We have a video here from his website that we can show at the end. It is almost 5:30, so this would be decision for you whether you would like to watch it or not. But it is a video of his students really talking about their experience and talking about how they grew in their sense of self as they move on. And again, for me, the proof of his ideas and leadership is that these young people just glow with centeredness and a sense of self and a real sense of place in the world. And despite not having very many opportunities, able to move forward and do something good for themselves and others. So if you could stay and watch, that'd be great.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. All right. So thank you very much.
Black and strong.
I am somebody.
I am bold.
I am a world of peace at war within itself.
I am a person with strong personality.
I am a dropout. I am greatness in the making.
I am a scholar.
I am a proud African American woman.
I am a graduate.
I am dedicated and engulfed.
Can you see me now? You didn't see me when I was hurting that night. You didn't see me when I was dropping out of school. You didn't see me when I had an accident. You didn't see me when I was crying myself to sleep. You didn't see me when I was smoking. You didn't see me when I was being used, abused, and neglected. You didn't see me when I was homeless and begging. You didn't see me when I was hungry. You didn't see me when I needed you most. You didn't see me when I wanted and needed love. You didn't see me when I graduated. You didn't see me when I had bills to pay. You didn't see me when I needed your support. You didn't hear me when I was pouring my heart out to you. I'm now standing here on my own 2 feet. I now have everything out of life I could ask for and have ever wanted. I'm now on my grind, moving forward, no longer asking for your support, no longer asking for help. The one and only question I have now is, can you hear me now?
My experience being locked up was hell. 4 years of hell, you know what I'm saying? Crying for the first 2 years of my life in prison, had to grow up in prison, you know what I'm saying? I was a little ass boy when I was like basically just turned a teenager, you know what I'm saying? 3 years shy from a teenager. I was hurting, bro, like man, missing my family, man.
They don't treat you like a human being in jail. You know what I'm saying? They treat you like a number. Like they got too many people to look after, so you know what I'm saying? They can't take the time to really feel if you know what I'm saying, doing right, or if you what you did, what you went there for, if you did it or not. They ain't got time for that. You know what I'm saying? So if you ain't got no money, you ain't got no lawyer to really tell your side of the story, you know what I'm saying? They don't want to hear it. So you is like a number, you know what I'm saying? You gotta wait your turn. People join gangs because they look for something that they haven't had at home, and which is like either a father figure or just friends, somebody to back them up.
Not having a father, I've been through a lot because I had to teach myself a lot of things, and not really having a mother, I had to find love other places, so it kind of made me stronger in certain ways. Probably the death of my brother. Well, he got shot, and he ain't make it, I guess. Some block stuff going on in the hood about nothing, really. Man, changed a lot of things, my outlook about life.
My greatest pain would have to be the loss of my father, It was the hardest pain I ever dealt with in life. Yeah. It was back in December 13th, 02. Yeah, he was shot and murdered out west on Lake Street in Pulaski. So that was something that I always deal with every morning. I get up every day, I go to sleep. Yeah.
Everything is unfair, it's not supposed to be peaches and cream, but everything it's not fair, and and it kicks people who don't need to be kicked. My greatest fear is, not having no feelings for people. Not caring if somebody, pass away right next to me. I want to actually feel like some remorse or something. I don't want to be one of them older people who don't care. That's like my biggest fear. And actually, other people around me, I don't want them to not fear. Life has desensitized me. I'm still not, inhumane shit is just how people live, how people treat each other, how people treat us, how our life is set up and how we being treated, shit just, forgive me for being a peaceful dude, but I just, I'm like on the change the world type trip if I could.
Change is unavoidable. Changes is everything in life.
It was through the struggles, the heartaches. I think that was what made me a better person. If I wouldn't have had those struggles, I wouldn't be here.
Going from a boy to thinking I was a man to actually becoming a man.
Use your brain and you'll soon realize that this world's one the same. If you observe, you'll see how it makes sense.
I'm focused right now, so there's a lot of stuff in my past, that I thought I couldn't do. I'm doing that right now.
Don't worry about looking like this. Don't worry about following these group of kids or being with my friends. I say worry about self.
I know some people well here really feel me, and I'm gonna make an impact.
Unlimited possibilities. What would the future bring you? Who knows what the future will bring? Who knows the unlimited possibilities we're facing? The end is near, but life is unlimited. Environment is there, but energy is unlimited. Economy is down, but millionaires are being made. My point is, how could you be a part of the earth without being part of the earth? Being here, limitless. Nobody to call on, one with nature. Unlimited possibility.
Every day I try to do right, but I end up doing wrong. Wonder if I'll be a bum when I'm grown. Eating out the trash, doing anything for cash. Recycling cans for cash, I need it fast. Wake up in the morning with no towel to wipe my ass. Laying in the box and remembering.
My future is everything.
I will be the best. My future is my kids.
My future is everybody.
My future is me.
My future is bright.
This is my future.
All these memories. So many of them.
See all the memories, they'll never leave, so take caution. 1, 2, 3, breathe. I can feel it in my heart, I can feel it in my sleep, I can see it in my thoughts. When I think, don't know where to go. Lost in the cold, people telling me to hold on, I wanna let go. That's what they don't know, will never be told. So steady, I carry up.
Thank you, Ted. That was great to watch.
Thank you. That brought back memories. That was about
Early.
yeah, like 10 years ago now. I haven't looked at that in a long time. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder where those kids are now. That kids isn't right. Those young people.
Yeah, they were young adults, right?
They are. Yeah. So, okay. Well, I think we're probably time to close. We've had a really good, important time together. And I thank you all for your good questions, and Ted for your great answers. And hopefully we'll move us forward on this subject. So everyone take care, and good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ted.
Yeah, thanks, Ted.
Ted.
Thanks, Ted.
Thanks. Gail's coughing. She did well. Till next time.
Until next time.
See you, Sylvia.
See you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was wonderful.
Thank you. Is Bob still here? No, he isn't. So okay, I'll end it for us. But
Thanks again, Gail.
All right, well, here we go.
Hope you're feeling better. All right.
Thank you. I'm sorry. It's just the RSV virus I got.
Yeah, I think my daughter had that. She was really sick for like almost, it was like 10 days. She was later down. Oh man, my oldest daughter. Yeah, it was rough. Yeah.
So
worse than COVID, but I hope you're feeling better.
Everyone be safe and happy. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. You say it was worse than COVID?